my work specifically focuses on surface water and on climate. And so I focus on things like rainfall and stream flow, and also the infrastructure aspect of that, which is like how that water actually flows into a reservoir. What are the reservoir operations that we're using to manage that water, and how is that water then distributed to users that live across areas like California?
Hello and welcome back to Unsustainable. Today we're chatting with Rohini Gupta, a Postdoctoral Research Associate in the Steinschneider Lab at Cornell University. She works to inform water resources planning and management, especially under a changing climate. Using fields like machine learning, atmospheric science and hydrology, she models hydroclimate risk, focusing on where changes to policy or infrastructure offer promising pathways to adapt to future climate extremes. An essential and enlightening conversation. Please enjoy.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rohini Gupta, for joining us today. I'm really excited to chat with you about your work as it relates to, and we can go into more details, but in general, my understanding is that you do a lot of modeling to help understand risk as it relates to hydrology and like water scarcity and improving models to help people kind of better predict kind of the water cycle in short.
Sure. Yeah,
Um,
that's a really great summary. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. And yeah, my background is in water resources planning and management, and I kind of work in multiple areas across the United States. Primarily, I would say the focus of a lot of my graduate school work has been in the Western U.S., so California and Colorado. And yeah, we try to understand how resilient or vulnerable our water systems are, particularly for me under a changing climate, which is deeply uncertain. We try to assess where those vulnerabilities are sort of taking place in our system and how we might either build new infrastructure or change the way that we might operate some of these systems to make them more resilient and to decrease vulnerabilities for different stakeholders in the system.
how did you get into this field? You received your PhD at Cornell in civil and environmental engineering, but what was the path that brought you to this point? Why are you passionate about this work?
Yeah, so I think I would have to kind of go back to my childhood. I don't know if that's cliche or not, but I grew up in a place called Carbondale in southern Illinois. And our family home is in a very forested area with a very diverse ecosystem, lots of plant life, and a lot of fauna. And tangentially, my parents are both professors in engineering at Southern Illinois University, which is in the town that we're located in. So I think I was inspired by both of those things. I was deeply engaged when I was younger in wildlife protection and environmentalism. And I was also really pulled into the academic space by my parents who were doing really awesome research. And I felt from a very young age, I felt really drawn to go into higher level research and to go to grad school. And so after high school, I started a degree in environmental engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. And I got very steeped into that. And I did undergraduate research also in kind of like renewable energy systems, and eventually found my way into water systems. Cornell had a great program in water resources systems. And when I came and visited here, I was just really impressed with the faculty and the resources and the scale of projects that I would get to work on. And so I started sort of in that space and have remained there ever since 2017. So I've been at Cornell for a long time and have just really loved the work that I've been doing.
So you grew up in Illinois.
Yes.
Did you see, it might have been too early and it might have changed over time, but any climate change impacts on the land where you grew up? Because we know kind of in central United States in the Midwest, the hydrology is very volatile.
Yeah, absolutely. The hydrology And climate around the United States as a whole is really volatile, and everyone has their sort of personal anecdotes. For us, one thing that, we're in southern Illinois, so it's quite swampy, quite humid in the summer, and our summers just get hotter and hotter every year. It's something that you can very tangibly see. And we also get a lot of storms in the summer, a lot of thunderstorms, and those storms get more intense. And you have to be very careful about, can we actually attribute this to climate change or not to climate change? But it's something that we for sure are feeling there. And I think a lot of other locations across the United States are feeling their own version of a changing climate, or something that's not the norm, I would say.
And so, how would you say, I'm sure there's a lot of specific examples and reasons, but that climate change is impacting the water cycle?
It's shifting a lot, and it's like I said, it's very region specific. So I had mentioned that a lot of my work in the Western US was focused on trying to determine like how plausible climate futures might play out. And one thing that we're seeing specifically in places like California is that they have these cycles of flood and drought. And you probably have seen this on the news where in the winters they get these really intense atmospheric rivers that bring a lot of water, a lot of flooding. But then, right, you turn around a few months into the summer and you're in a really prominent severe drought. And what we're seeing is these cycles of flood and drought are becoming longer, they're becoming more intense, they're becoming more frequent. In places like Colorado, we're actually seeing aridification, where you just have a dryness and a desertification essentially of the region. So it's manifesting in different ways. But in the regions that I've done work in, it's really kind of manifesting in more intense extremes than what we have seen before.
Is your work mostly interested in overall rainfall amounts, or do you also look at groundwater or reservoirs?
So I am by trade more in hydrology, which is surface water. Groundwater is incredibly important, incredibly dynamic and complex in places like California, where there is some groundwater that exists in aquifers and people are pulling that water out. So there's a lot of dynamic exchanges going on with users really relying on surface water. When it's very dry, they might overpump groundwater. My work specifically focuses on surface water and on climate. And so I focus on things like rainfall and stream flow, and also the infrastructure aspect of that, which is like how that water actually flows into a reservoir. What are the reservoir operations that we're using to manage that water, and how is that water then distributed to users that live across areas like California?
So, if you're looking at mainly surface water, what makes it difficult in your research to predict how surface water is changing over time? I would think that that data could be easily accessible, but if we're looking to project into the future to see how that's going to change, what is impacting our ability to do that?
Yeah, so in regions specifically like the Western United States, there's a ton of uncertainty around how climate is going to manifest, primarily because there's a ton of natural variability that's just inherently a characteristic of the climate there. Natural variability is really just natural fluctuations in the climate system that come from different climate components interacting. And this exists regardless of any sort of anthropogenic or human driven climate change. Natural variability is something that's really hard to quantify, and it can also dampen or amplify the effects of climate change. And what we struggle with is really trying to quantify what phase is natural variability in, where are we moving to, what should we sort of expect when natural variability interacts with the changes that we're seeing that are related to human driven activity. And so, actually, a lot of the work at the beginning of my PhD was trying to understand, okay, what is the extent of natural variability that we expect to see in California? How is that going to interact with climate change, and how is that ultimately going to impact users? And this is something, again, as I mentioned, it's difficult because a good sense of natural variability is going to come from really long data sets. And in most locations, actually around the United States, we don't have a lot of instrumental data. We have data for stream flow, for things like precipitation and temperature that really go back to the 1950s at the earliest. And even then, gauges are very sparse and we're just starting to come online. But natural variability is something that can operate at decadal to multi-decadal timescales, and we didn't have instrumental data where we were actually getting a good sense of what are the extremes that California could possibly see. We were seeing things from the last 80 years of data or so, but our goal was really to try to understand more about like how do we more comprehensively characterize how bad these extremes can get.
So, in order to know what's going to happen in the future, you first need a baseline of, well, this is within the realm of normal, and then you can say how that's going to change from normal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a perfect way to describe it. And you can imagine that, like, your definition of what's normal is going to be highly linked to how much data you have available, right? Like, we have ways of defining what is like a historically what the worst drought is that California has experienced, or like on average what flooding events might look like. But as we start to extend these data sets back, and this is kind of leading into what my first PhD paper was on, which was can we actually get a more comprehensive understanding by extending these data sets in some way. And one thing that's really awesome is that there are so many environmental data sets that carry a lot of information about climate. So, for example, I think one type of paleo data that maybe the public is more used to are ice cores, which we often use to get a better understanding of atmospheric composition and temperature across the world for hundreds of thousands of years. That information is captured within air bubbles that are in these ice cores. Now, specifically for what we're doing in California, you have to be careful about what kind of information and proxies you actually need that can be informative of the climate and specifically at a time scale that is relevant to policy and management. That was a really big part of the work. And so with California, there might be various types of paleo data that exist for the region that could be used. We had a lot of success with tree rings. And so it turns out that California has a network of trees that are very moisture sensitive. And that means that on an annual time scale, they do a really good job of capturing how wet or how dry it was in the region. And so, how this works is that you have a group of people. This is really in the field of dendrochronology, which it's not my primary field, but I was able to sort of access the data after it had been processed by a group of people who go out and they basically core these trees. So they use borers. You don't have to cut the tree down, so it's a sustainable process. You bore into the tree and you get a tiny slice of it, like the size of a pencil, and they mount that and they look at the width of the tree rings. And basically, what that tells us is if you have a sort of a narrow width for a specific year, that usually corresponds to it was a drier year, so the tree didn't actually grow so much. During a wetter year, you might see more growth, so you'll see a wider ring. And so, what they do is they sort of overlay these core records with instrumental data for precipitation, for example. And so what you're doing is you're kind of creating a relationship between these tree ring widths and how much precipitation you were seeing. And so basically what we were able to do was establish actually a connection between this tree ring data and the presence of different circulation patterns that bring specific types of weather to California, which was really interesting. And so we were able to sort of develop these relationships in the modern period where we have actual gauge data or instrumental data and we have trees, and then reconstruct an understanding of California's weather back 600 years using this network of tree ring data that has been provided to us by really awesome groups of people who go out and they'll core trees all throughout the western United States. So there's actually a really beautiful network of like, I think around 1,500 trees that have been cored to create these chronologies that people then use for these types of climate studies. So this data has become publicly available and we were able to sort of leverage it in our study.
Is this with the U.S. Forest Service or through an academic institution?
Usually, the U.S. Forest Service might be involved. I'm not actually sure all of who were involved in creating these chronologies, but it usually is a mix of probably some sort of forest services and academic institutions where you have a strong dendrochronology focus, and a lot of groups, academic groups, make it their focus of trying to actually come up with well represented chronologies for different regions. So they do a ton of really great work in that space, and then they make that data available for us to use, which is awesome.
That is really interesting because I can imagine where if you're looking back in time, you probably have maybe equal tree rings, but then maybe it's a drought for a number of years, and then maybe you get this big rain event. And I wonder if in the future, as climate change is making like more severe dry, more severe wet, you have a greater number of really concentrated rings and then a greater number of very wide rings as opposed to this balanced maybe super
Yeah,
skinny and then
absolutely. And if you look at these cores back in time, you do see that. You do see the presence of, for what we call mega droughts, which are droughts that can last on the order of decades. We have looked at our reconstructions, and what was really awesome is that we created this cool method for a reconstruction that was using these tree rings, and we were converging on the same events that other groups have reconstructed and discovered. And we know that, especially in the Western US, there are times where there have been very severe mega droughts that were worse than what we're seeing now. And actually it's just become known that the current mega drought that California is in, which started in 2000, is the worst mega drought compared to the last one that we thought was the worst, which was around the late 1500s. So certainly it's very interesting to see that progression. If you go back in time, you will see concentrated, very large sections where that corresponded to a pluvial or a flood period, and then other sections that correspond to mega droughts. And those, yeah, like those, the identification of those events have come from a lot of people doing different studies with different types of paleo data, with like different species of trees, with different methods. And I think it's really awesome that we all are kind of converging on the same signals, essentially.
do you also consider snowmelt and the timing of snowmelt? Because I imagine that that greatly impacts surface water during certain times of year, and the
Absolutely.
frequency of an amount of snowmelt could be changing. So, is that incorporated at all into what
Yeah,
you're looking at?
absolutely. There are different ways that you can incorporate snowmelt. Specifically, with what we were doing in California, as we were taking these tree rings and we were taking the dynamics that we had reconstructed and using them as sort of like an input or a forcing to a weather generator. And what that was allowing us to do was to create these long sequences of daily precipitation and temperature that we were then forcing through hydrologic models. And when you force the precip and temp through a hydrologic model, you get stream flow. And one aspect of the hydrologic model is a snow module, which basically will take information about temperature and elevation, where the hydrologic model is conditioned for different locations, and convert some amount of that precipitation to snow. And so, as we essentially started creating climate change scenarios, we were increasing temperatures, and that was sort of manifesting in either reductions in, it was actually very interesting, either total reductions in snowmelt or shifts in timing of snowmelt. So, all of those things were manifesting, and it was a consequence of just sort of like where you're located like at what elevation band you're going to get different responses. We were just finding really interesting nonlinear responses. So it's not just that as the temperature increases, snowmelt is just going to decrease uniformly. Sometimes you might have just a buildup of snow just because you're at an elevation where you're not going to have that much of an effect. But then you may have melting that shifts and creates big flood events. So all of these things are actually very interesting because as it gets warmer, you also have the greater capacity for extreme precipitation events, which might actually lead to more snow depending on where you're located. So it actually is a very interesting, complex system, which is one of the ways I sort of define my work is in complex systems, where you often have really nonlinear dynamics across both like human and natural systems.
That makes sense. So you have your baseline data that you've reconstructed or gathered from all these different sources, tree rings, ice cores, and you want to see how it's going to be impacted in the future. So you mentioned temperature. In your different climate scenarios to see how all of this is going to be affected, is temperature the main driving climate scenario where you look at different like low temperature, medium, really high, and see what happens over time? Are there other environmental factors that you're including in these climate scenarios as well? How's that work out for you?
Yeah, so exactly. So we have essentially the way that this generator works is that we have a baseline set of temperature and precipitation that we are getting essentially from the tree ring. So we have this baseline 600-year weather sequence. And we create climate change scenarios essentially by imposing two different types of changes. The first change is just shifts to temperature. So we know that California is getting warmer, and there's a range of plausible temperature increases that we could see. And we basically look at downscaled climate projections to see, like, regionally, how do we expect temperature changes to look. And so we ended up sampling a range of 1 to 4 degrees, which was kind of like a mid to worst case scenario from climate projections. But also, as the atmosphere gets warmer, it has a greater capacity to hold moisture. And so we also expect precipitation profiles to change. Specifically, we expect our wetter extremes to get wetter and our drier extremes to get drier. And so statistically, what we can do is adjust our precipitation distribution to represent this. So essentially, what we're doing is imposing these sort of changes onto our baseline weather, and then we create new ensembles that basically are plausible regional climate changes that we could expect to see. And so we take those new climate change ensembles, push them through our hydrologic model, and we look at what changes we see to stream flow from baseline to these new scenarios. And we also came up with methods of really partitioning out which of these drivers, either natural baseline variability from the tree rings versus climate change signals, what was actually driving the changes that we were seeing in metrics that were important to us to assess extremes. So we came up with a variety of flooding and drought metrics that you can calculate just by looking at, your ultimate stream flow ensemble. So we're like, what's the duration of droughts? What's their frequency? What's their intensity? And what's the intensity of flooding events that we're getting? And we were able to actually attribute that for different types of metrics, you're going to have different influences from natural variability or climate change. And we were actually seeing that of the climate change factors that we had imposed, temperature was actually a really big driver in the increase or variability in the metrics that we were seeing. But it was really important to note that it's both natural variability and climate change that were affecting these metrics. There weren't metrics that were only affected by natural variability or only affected by climate change. It was really the joint behavior of these mechanisms that was changing the variability in these metrics. And so I think that's something that's just really important to not lose sight of, is that we have to consider and really represent natural variability well, to make sure that we are doing a better job of understanding the interactions between the two and how they could potentially amplify each other, which is what, is a worrisome thing to think about, but very important for water systems management.
So what did you see as you increased the temperatures over time and how that impacted, I guess, rainfall? So you input all these different drivers in your models. What was the outcome that you were seeing at these different levels?
Yeah, so basically, what we were seeing was an intensity in both flooding and drought events, which was kind of expected. So, if we're making changes in temperature and precip, we kind of expect that to be somewhat reflected in the ultimate stream flow. What was actually really interesting was that you create these scenarios where you have extreme floods or extreme droughts. And we then pushed that through a water systems model for the state of California to then assess actually what are the impacts to the human users, which is something that's really, really important. That it's really important to understand the complexities of this idea, which is that we have these extreme events, but really the ultimate sort of impact to users is actually going to be dictated by so many different factors. So it's not only this extreme drought event, but it's sort of also based off of what current policy looks like, what are initial conditions in the reservoirs, what are the user's individual water rights, which is a really big institutional component of California's water system, is that you have users that have senior water rights and users that have junior water rights. And if you have senior water rights, then that means you get access to your water first. And people who are maybe have more junior water rights get access to their water later. And so in times where you have droughts, it becomes very contentious where there are different users that are getting their water and some users that will fall short because they're junior users. And so, really, it's a lot about how that water progresses through the system and interacts with infrastructure and with water rights to actually lead to vulnerabilities.
So how do you know, or how does a person get either junior or senior water rights?
Yeah, so this is a system that I think is potentially on track to change because it is something that Colorado is also experiencing right now. Basically, the West operates under prior appropriation water law, which basically means that the date that you got your water rights is going to be highly indicative of the seniority. So, what you find is that in places like California, a lot of older farms that have been around for a really long time have these senior water rights. And so it's really hard as a new user to get senior water rights in California. I think at this point you would have to buy out like some of these older farms to actually achieve those water rights. So it is a very contentious process. And it turns out actually what's quite interesting to me in Colorado and also in some places like California, some of the most senior water rights holders actually end up being tribal members. So different tribes have actually been on this land for much longer. And it turns out that they have very senior water rights. And many tribes are going through the legal processes of actually obtaining the rights that are owed to them. And they may play a major role in how they decide to use that water and how they decide to distribute it. So yeah, it's a very contentious process right now, especially when both California and Colorado are dealing with really bad drought situations. So there might be some changes to the system.
No doubt. I mean, everybody needs water, and to say
Yeah,
that some people deserve water first over other people sounds like environmental justice issue first and foremost.
absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
does it happen on a scale of neighbors? So say I move in to somewhere in California tomorrow, but my neighbor who is 12 feet over has been living there for a really long time. given a drought situation, would my water be cut off, but my neighbors still receive it? Is it at that level where they're able to like move the water that fine scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's essentially how it works is that a lot of these major farms or irrigation districts have access to water that's coming out of these reservoirs by way of canals. And so they can basically operate this distribution in such a way to make sure that people who have the more senior water rights will get their water. So yeah, so you can see maybe water running by you that you aren't going to be able to actually access, which can be super tough if you are a smaller farm or just a smaller entity that has these junior water rights. And I believe that there is talk in California. This is like on a scale that's a little bit more micro than what I've been working on, but like the idea of buying and trading water. If you're a farmer that you decide to grow crops that aren't so water intensive, you could maybe sell some of your water to another group or another farm that actually needs that water. And you could sell it maybe at a fair price. And I think they're trying to create water markets such that this water can be distributed back and forth between different groups. And it's not just wasted if it's water that you can't actually use or so I think that that's another mechanism that could be in place that could be really helpful to make sure that more of that water can be distributed around.
Is it possible to transition to having senior water rights once you've had junior? Are you able to buy in to having or senior rights, or is it just based on date in which you receive it? And is there a
Yeah,
date at which you transition to being senior?
that's a great question. I would have to follow up with you on details of like the legality. One thing that I think makes a lot of sense though is just trying to increase the diversity of your water sources. So you may have senior water rights, but maybe that's coming from one location or one reservoir. And so if you have the capacity to sort of distribute where you're getting your where you're able to pull your water from, and if you for instance have access to groundwater, that's also a contingency that is super helpful. So I think one of the most sustainable sort of mechanisms out there to sort of sustaining yourself when you do have this period of hydroclimate variability is by making sure that you have access to a diversity of resources that you can pull from when you need. And I think that's what a lot of users are trying to do. And one thing that's really interesting and I think really important to note is that I think we have always had preconceptions that if you're a senior water rights holder, you're somehow safe from all of these extremes. And really, what we find is that it's really bad for everyone, potentially. So we were looking at, for instance, in the tree ring data, we had found mega drought, a specific mega drought scenario that we wanted to sort of stress test our water system with. So this is a mega drought that we have reconstructed that happened in the late 1500s, and we want to know how does our modern water system do under these conditions. And so we push that streamflow ensemble through this water systems model and we track where water is flowing and who's coming out with vulnerabilities. And we basically were seeing below normal reservoir levels, multiple years of water deliveries that were below historical levels. So below even the worst modern droughts that we had in our record, which was, for instance, in the 2010s to 2017, that was a really bad drought for California during that period. And we were showing that under these mega drought conditions that we've reconstructed, it could actually be worse. And it was uniformly worse for senior water rights holders and junior water rights holders. So we were kind of demonstrating that, okay, some of these climate situations are really bad and everyone is going to be experiencing cuts, and you're not necessarily safe just by having these senior water rights. So really, it's like really pushing this idea of diversity of water sources. I think that's the most important.
If your models are able to demonstrate that with a 2-degree increase in temperature, we will have these stressors and this will impact your water, whether you're junior or senior, what are some actionable things that maybe the local government or any water resource managers could do to incorporate what you're producing into action?
Yeah, so this is something that it's hard. It's really important to sort of carefully think about this because there are sort of many different ways that you can approach this problem. You could potentially build new infrastructure. You could try to figure out how to better operate and manage reservoirs. You could also have adjustments at sort of the individual user level as well. And so often what we try to the philosophy that we try to sort of operate by is that we don't really know exactly what the future is going to look like, right? Like maybe it might be 2 degrees, it might be 3 degrees, but we want to make sure our systems are going to be resilient regardless. And so, what you're trying to do is just provide a map of a bunch of different possibilities. And at some point, maybe assign likelihoods to things that, mechanisms that we think are going to be more important in this next 50-year planning period. Because what you don't want to get into is a situation where you experience regret over maybe building a reservoir that doesn't actually end up being useful, but it's a sort of a decision that you have to make now that may take 10 to 20 years to actually fully manifest. And maybe the climate has changed, in those 10 to 20 years. And that's like a mechanism or a intervention that isn't actually useful anymore. So it's a very complicated thing to do is to like plan under uncertainty. So what we try to sort of demonstrate with our studies is, what is the map of sort of vulnerabilities that can be experienced and what would we recommend? And so, for instance, California is really heavily investing in building new infrastructure and coming up with ways of taking some of the floodwater that happens during atmospheric river events and trying to funnel it into aquifers, which I think is really promising because we know that in California, these cycles of flood and drought are going to become more intense. And as we start to see more intense rainfall and flooding events, most of that water is actually just pushed out into the ocean. It's not water that's actually being captured. So the hope is to take some of that water and divert it into reservoirs or into new off-stream storages that the government has sort of invested in. And they're also trying to build up canals such that that water can be pushed down into farmland that is located in the Central Valley in California. During the winter, that farmland is actually not really, it's dormant. Those crops aren't actually being grown. And so you can sort of flood that farmland and let it percolate into aquifers. So this is something called managed aquifer recharge. And I think it's a really awesome idea, a really great way of adapting to something that we feel confident about, which is that these cycles are going to become more intense. And so we need to figure out how can we make the best use of capturing that water when it is there? How can we store it, and how can we use that to sort of build up our aquifers? So that is actually an investment that I think is going to be really great for California, and a lot of people in our field, including some professors I work with, are doing analyses to try to understand how much of that water can be captured and what the efficiency is going to look like and what their recommendations are for what new infrastructure should be built. Another thing that I think is really important is to also lean into this idea that you don't often need to build new infrastructure. Sometimes you just need to manage your existing infrastructure better. And so, with reservoirs, one of the difficulties that exists is that many reservoirs are operated using rule curves that were developed in the 1950s that haven't really changed as our climate has changed. And so, there are groups that are working on more sophisticated ways to inform reservoir operations with things like forecasts. So, if you have a forecast of precipitation that you think might lead to flooding, then you're going to release water from your reservoir. And so that you're in a better position to capture that water, but you don't want to release so much water that you're giving away water that needs to be used in the summer. So this is something called FIRA, or Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations. So there's also a lot of work on how do we more flexibly and adaptively operate our infrastructure in a way that is using as much exogenous information as possible. So things like forecasts of rainfall coming in, or forecasts of snow melt, all of these things are really important tools and like data that we have available that can be used to help more intelligently, I think, operate reservoirs and make sure that we are using them to their fullest capabilities.
The models that you use, which have been trained using California data, is it possible to then use those to predict what's happening on the east coast of the United States? Would you have to maybe retrain it with the baseline data for maybe tree rings there? How would that work?
Yeah, so it is a little bit more. It's a nuanced concept where the first of all, the tree rings that we're using really are good indicators of moisture in California, because California gets only a few rain events, and those are coming from atmospheric rivers. And the trees tend to be very sensitive to cold season precipitation, which is when that precipitation is actually sort of arriving in California. So they're really good indicators of moisture. Whereas in other locations in the United States, you might not have trees as being like their growth being very correlated. So there are tree ring networks that exist all across the world in the United States that are used in many different places. So you have to verify that the networks that exist there are actually representative of the precipitation, for example, or stream flow at the time scale that is important to you. And then specifically with the weather generator that was taking in the tree rings as this like input data, the weather generator was specifically built for places like California where you have weather regimes that are basically these circulation patterns that are dictating the storms that California is seeing. So we were able to identify characteristic atmospheric patterns that bring specific types of weather to California. And that is actually not true of a lot of areas in the United States. To specifically do the study that we did in another location, you would need the presence of weather regimes and also the presence of tree ring data that would actually correlate highly to some sort of indicator of the weather there. But we certainly have created a lot of different ensembles of climate futures for different locations, which is awesome. So it is a method and a tool that is transferable.
I could see how that would be very useful on a super broad scale if folks from all different regions are able to use that and then take that information and then tell their local resource managers, water resource managers, and hopefully do policy change, because that's really what I assume all this research is hopefully going to lead to one day, is policy and actionable change.
Yeah, that was a really big driving force. I'm a person who I think is really computational by nature, but my PhD ended up being really interdisciplinary. And we were just putting together insight and data and methods from dendrochronology, from atmospheric science, from complex systems, and just finding a way to sort of create these frameworks where we're taking all these really good ideas and trying to distill it down into data sets and into tools that are actually usable by those who are running the models that are being used to sort of dictate policy. So that was something that was really important to me, was to know that my work is really helping to sort of shape and provide those data sets that can be used for these water systems analyses that ultimately can be used to make recommendations about how people should be um, prepping and how to make these water systems more resilient.
And you might have just touched on this, but there might be a little bit more. What would the next steps be? Like, I'm sure what you did doesn't just stop there. Is there anything that's kind of into the future, what you'd like to see, where you left off.
Yeah, my postdoc work right now is in the Great Lakes region, so I have kind of left the Western United States work, and I'm hoping that, there's a lot of really great work that's being done in that space. A lot of my work kind of ended with demonstrating that there are vulnerabilities that we are seeing at different scales, at the reservoir level, at the individual user level. And we're demonstrating that it's really bad historically. It's been really bad if we were to take these past climate scenarios, and it will get bad if we start to layer on also anthropogenic climate change. But we were not in a position to give advice on exactly what changes need to be made to become most resilient. And this is because we didn't do any extra analyses on specifically what was driving the vulnerabilities that different users are experiencing. And for that, you would need to do something like a sensitivity analysis where you really extract, was it this specific characteristic of the drought? Was it multiple droughts in tandem? Was it droughts that are interacting with specific reservoir levels or specific modes of operation that are ultimately leading to the vulnerabilities to these users. Without really digging into the mechanisms, it's then really hard to understand exactly what you need to do to combat that. So, what I'm really hoping for is that somebody will go in and do a more in depth sensitivity analysis where we can start to actually attribute that specific vulnerabilities faced by specific users is due to X, Y, and Z. And therefore, we know that the mechanisms that we need are a new reservoir, or we need to change the way that we operate. It's really hard to give suggestions on exactly what needs to be done until you do analyses like these. These models are really complex, so doing a sensitivity analysis, for example, is really computationally difficult because what you're doing is making small perturbations to your inputs and seeing how much that affects the outputs of your users. And that's really the way you tease out exactly what mechanisms are creating changes that you're seeing. And these models, again, you would have to run them using a lot of compute power, run a lot of simulations, and try to tease out those connections to then provide that generalized insight on what might be the right interventions to use. And that is something that, there was just never any time in my PhD to really work out the details of how that might look. But I do think that is a really awesome logical next step to then be able to provide actionable advice on what specific users should actually be able to do once they understand what their risk profile is. Then you could say, oh, maybe you should diversify your water sources, or oh, maybe you should try to consider getting different water rights. Things like actual suggestions that we could give to people is like a step that we haven't gotten to yet.
Now, you went from the West Coast, which is arid, losing water a lot, and now you're in the Great Lakes region, which is one
Yeah.
of the largest pools of fresh water globally. What are you doing there?
Yeah. It's really, really cool because the Great Lakes is still experiencing, everyone's combating this idea of what's going to happen under climate change. And the lake levels in the Great Lakes are incredibly uncertain. It's really uncertain what's going to happen to lake levels under climate change. And so that's kind of the space that I'm in. So it's similar in that it's still water resources analyses, but now they have a different set of objectives, a different set of systems. There's not a lot of capacity in the Great Lakes to actually build new infrastructure. So a lot of the focus then needs to be on really operating the infrastructure reservoirs there in a more adaptive way. And there's been a lot of focus on coming up with more refined forecasts of water levels. So they have different objectives and different interventions that they're looking at. My work specifically in the Great Lakes is focused on runoff, which there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the Great Lakes basin. But the idea is that the Great Lakes, sort of the way the water balance works, is that there are three main components that are driving lake levels. precipitation that is falling directly on the lake, evaporation where water is leaving the lake, and then runoff from the land into the lakes. And there's a heavy amount of uncertainty about how all of these different components are going to change in the future. We think maybe that evaporation is going to increase, that precipitation as a whole maybe across all the lakes is going to also increase, but there are a lot of intricacies there and interactions across these components that make it really difficult to understand exactly how this is going to manifest once again. And so my work is actually on the runoff component. And specifically, there about 30% of the Great Lakes Basin is ungauged. So we don't even really have a good idea of how much runoff is going into the Great Lakes. And so the work that I'm doing right now, it's a little bit of a pivot where we're trying to essentially provide better estimates of runoff in those ungauged areas. And for this, we're using deep learning and basically large machine learning models to create extended reconstructions of runoff throughout the Great Lakes Basin. So I just submitted a paper on this where we created this model that essentially was taking information from meteorology. Like we have meteorology that goes back in time. We also have information about the physical characteristics of these locations. And we have information potentially from gauges around that might actually have data. And we can use all of that information in these machine learning models to then make a prediction at these locations where we don't have data. So, a big part of my postdoc so far has been developing these models and developing these reconstructions of runoff at over 600 different locations back to 1950. And so, what this has provided is a data product of these long runoff records that in some locations didn't actually exist before. In other locations, they were very sparse. And so we've kind of gap filled that using all the information that we have that we think is relevant to make those predictions. And so I'm really excited to provide this to our community. We work with so many different partners, from Indigenous partners in the Great Lakes region to other academic partners and people who are doing their like local water managers who are doing water systems analyses, and they don't have a lot of data to understand trends or to calibrate their own models. And so I think this product is going to be awesome because it's just going to provide that data for a lot of locations where there just wasn't a lot before. So we're really happy with this and excited to get this out into the public soon when the paper hopefully goes through the review process. So that's what I've been working on, and just kind of continuing down on other smaller projects in that track right now.
It's an incredible project to be on because the Great Lakes serves, gosh, how many people?
30 million people.
30 million. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
And
the
so,
largest freshwater resource, and as you know, just like a really important water system for the region, for drinking water, for shipping, for recreation, for the ecosystem. It's been such a treat to be able to work on a water system that is actually physically closer to me than the Western US. So I see so much of it, of my work, just like every day, I see it where we live in Ithaca. So that has been really special to me to be able to do water resources in a more local capacity.
and I can only imagine that is going to get increasingly more important under climate change stressors and increasing population and just global water stress. So that's really great that you're on the forefront of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like, it's similar to California where we really want to have a better understanding of what happened in the past that really allows us the best baseline to then prepare for to understand if the emergent trends that we're seeing are trends that we saw in the past, or are they completely new, or are they unfounded trends. We're not really sure, but I definitely have really loved kind of being in that space where we're trying to come up with a comprehensive baseline where we really feel that we are kind of creating the longest data sets possible and really using that as a springboard to then um, make sure that we're like holistically planning in a way that is makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today, and I'm sure our viewers will really look forward to hearing more about this. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
I'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye.
Bye.